Hello everyone. In this session, we want to look at some virtual machine settings. The first setting that we're going to look at is the Hyper-V virtual switch. We're also going to look at generation 1 and 2 virtual machines and single root input-output virtualization. In a previous session, we created a virtual machine and we looked at assigning the memory. The next step in the creation of that virtual machine was configuring networking. And we opted not to configure networking for that session because we said we can always come back and configure networking after the virtual machine was created. In order to choose a network adapter, we need to be able to link up that network adapter with a virtual switch. So you would first need to have a virtual switch. Here you see we'll be able to click the down arrow and choose the switch that we wanted to configure our network adapter to. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at how we would create the virtual switch and the different type of switch modes that are available when we create the virtual switch. The virtual switch has 3 modes. It has an external mode, an internal mode, and a private mode. If we choose to create an external switch, the external virtual switch allows the virtual machine to communicate with the physical network. In other words, you're able to communicate outside of your virtual machine or outside of the host. You're able to access the internet. The next mode is the internal mode, where if you choose to create an internal switch, then there is communication with the virtual machines on the host. You can communicate between the virtual machines and the physical computer, and you can communicate between each virtual machine on that host. You will not be able to communicate to the physical network if you are using an internal virtual switch. If you choose to create a private virtual switch, then there is communication only by the virtual machines that run on the physical computer. So when you are creating your virtual switch, according to your setup, according to what you want on your network, you will choose either external, internal, or private. Let's take a look to see how we are going to set up or create that virtual switch. In order to create the virtual switch, we need to access Virtual Switch Manager. So we're going to click on Tools, Hyper-V Manager, and in the Actions pane, we're going to click on Virtual Switch Manager. We have here New Virtual Network Switch, and in the right-hand pane, we have External, which again helps you to communicate outside of the virtual machine. You are able to communicate with the physical network once you choose the external switch. And then we have internal, and the internal switch allows you to communicate with the virtual machines on the host and also to communicate with the host itself. And then we have private, which allows you to communicate just between the virtual machines on the host. We're going to be creating our external switch. So we're going to click on external and then click create virtual switch. We need to give the name for the virtual switch. So we're going to go to the name box here and we're going to press the delete key. And we're going to type the name of the virtual switch and we're going to call it external virtual switch. So that's what we will type, external virtual switch, and press enter. And we see here that we have external virtual switch, and by default we have allow management operating system to share the network adapter, so that's there by default. Another setting that we want to look at here is enable single root input output. Single root input output virtualization in Windows Server 12 is a setting that enables virtual machines to perform input output directly to the physical adapter, bypassing the root partition. So to enable single root input output, we simply click the box single root input output. Now, configuring single root input output has two stages. We have to enable single root input output on the virtual network adapter switch. And then we also have to go to the virtual machine itself and enable single root input output. So we're going to go ahead and say OK at this point. And to this message, applying network changes, we're going to go ahead and click yes. Now, we need to use that virtual switch that we just created, and we're going to use it in the process of creating a virtual machine. So we're going to right click on the host, server 1, and we're going to say new virtual machine. At the before you begin screen, we want to click on next. And we want to type the name of the virtual machine, and we're going to call the virtual machine virtual class. That is VIRTUALCLASS. And we're going to press enter. And we're not going to change the location. We're going to leave the location at the default location. And we're going to go ahead and click next. And here we come to the type of virtual machine, generation 1 and generation 2. We're going to select generation 2, but we're going to pause a moment and we're actually going to talk about what generation 1 and generation 2 means. The generation of a virtual machine determines the virtual hardware and functionality that is presented to the virtual machine. Now we have two types here, two supported virtual machine generations, generation 2 and generation 1. With generation 2, we now have, instead of the BIOS firmware, we have UEFI based firmware. So if you're creating a virtual system and you're using generation 2 for that virtual machine, then it means that instead of using BIOS, we are now going to use Unified Extensible Firmware Interface instead of BIOS. When we are using Generation 2, the majority of legacy devices have also been removed from Generation 2 virtual machine. Generation 1 will give you the same virtual hardware as previous operating systems. With Generation 1, if we needed to boot from the network card, which is the Pixie boot, we had to choose a legacy network adapter to do that. With Generation 2, we can Pixie boot using a standard network adapter. With Generation 2, we can also boot from a SCSI virtual hard disk. In previous versions of Hyper-V, you could not boot a virtual machine from a SCSI attached virtual hard disk or from a DVD. Generation 2 virtual machines can boot from a virtual hard disk or DVD that is attached to the SCSI controller. So that's another change there. Then we have Secure Boot. Secure Boot is a feature that helps prevent unauthorized firmware, operating systems, or UEFI drivers from running at boot time. This is enabled by default for Generation 2 virtual machines. You can modify it after you create the virtual machine, but it is enabled by default. Then we have systems that are supported by the Generation 2 virtual machine. And those systems are Server 2012, 2012 R2 64-bit versions of Windows 8.1, 64-bit versions of Windows 8, and of course also Windows 10 and Server 2016. We now want to choose Generation 2 for our virtual machine. So we're going to click on Generation 2. Then we're going to click Next. The next thing that we want to configure is the memory. And the memory, we're going to put 32 gigs. So we're going to type 32 and press Enter. So for the memory, we're using 32 for our session here. Remember, after you specify the generation, that is when you assign the memory. We're going to go ahead and click Next. And at this point, we want to use that virtual switch that we created. So, by connection here, where it says not connected, we're going to click the down arrow. And we're going to select that switch that we had created, external virtual switch. And we're going to click on Next to continue. We want to create a virtual hard disk here. So we're going to leave that default option, create a virtual hard disk. And we're going to use the name virtual class, and you will get the extension VHDX. So we're going to go ahead and click Next. And we want to install the operating system later. So we're going to click on Next to accept that. And then we're going to click on Finish. Now what we want to do is to go into the settings of the virtual machine. Remember we had said that when we were configuring single root input-output, we had to configure it on the virtual machine manager settings, but we also had to configure it on the virtual machine. Where we're going to right click on the virtual machine and we're going to click on Settings. We want to expand network adapter here. And this is where we can go back in and modify the settings of the network adapter if we chose to. We want to click on hardware acceleration. And here at the very bottom of the screen on the right hand side, we have enable single root input output. So remember that we have to enable that on the virtual switch, and we also have to come to the virtual machine. On the network adapter, we choose hardware acceleration, and then we click enable single root input output. So we make sure that that's checked off, and then we can go ahead and say apply. And that is how we configure the single root input output. To recap, we have three modes for the virtual switch. We have external, internal, and private. External creates a virtual switch that binds to the physical network adapter so that virtual machines can access a physical network. The internal mode creates a virtual switch that can be used only by the virtual machines that run on the physical computer and between the virtual machines and the physical computer. The internal virtual switch, remember, does not provide connectivity to a physical network connection. And then there was a private switch, which creates a virtual switch that can be used only by the virtual machines that run on this physical computer. Generation 1 and 2, two types of generation that virtual machines support. Remember that if you choose generation 1, that is the older type, and that supports all the hardware for previous versions of Hyper-V. Generation 2 gives you Pixie Boot with a standard network adapter. You're able to boot from a SCSI virtual hard disk. You're able to boot from a SCSI virtual DVD, and secure boot is enabled by default. And last but not least, you are not running BIOS anymore. You are running what? UEFI firmware. Also remember that IDE drives and legacy network adapters, that support has been removed from generation 2. The operating systems that are supported by generation 2 virtual machines would be 2012 R2 2012, 64-bit version of Windows 8.1, 64-bit version of Windows 8, and also Windows 10 and Server 2016. This is the end of our session, and I want to thank you for listening.